They made me their perfect kid, then blamed me for everything. My family and I are Chinese by ethnicity. My parents had well-paid jobs back in China. They lived a very comfortable life there in the late 80s/early 90s. They were the 1% in the country. In the mid-90s, they moved to America. They struggled in the beginning but worked hard, found well-paid jobs, and managed a business. I was raised by my grandmother until I moved to New York City at age 3. My sister was born a few years later. With that said, I'm now going to get to the heart of the issue. From the moment I moved to America, the physical, mental, and emotional abuse from my parents began. I have very early memories of my father in a furious rage, ripping up my favorite clothes, my mother screaming and shaking me during an unsuccessful piano lesson until a nosebleed erupted. I remember my mother close fist punching me in the head and ribs because I whined about the kindergarten grad outfit she selected for me. I once blacked out after my father kicked me for running around at a museum. He hit me frequently with yardsticks and belts. Everything was dealt with physically. It should have been to nobody's surprise that I was a troubled child. Difficulties following instructions, engaging in fights, defensive, aggressive. Despite that I was doing well in school. I attended 6 different after-school courses. I was smart, talented in art and music. I was also the family show pony. Academic achievements and after-school classes, especially piano, were a luxury and a status symbol for Asian parents to show off. I hated it. I demanded a social life and time to play. I negotiated and argued for what I wanted. It was seen as extremely disrespectful to talk back to your parents. I was defiant as hell and I paid for it. My father liked to say that if a kid didn't listen, you could beat submission into them. It's true, he'd always say. Worked on me. Evidently, he was a victim of child abuse himself, and he didn't even know it. But it didn't work on me. With every beating, I was more obnoxious, and whether it was conscious or not, even more defiant. It's only after you survive it all, you look back and say, I'm so glad I never gave in. I didn't let them win, but at the time it hurt. It was torture. I wanted to be loved so badly that I thought for a while I could compromise and let them hurt me. If I had them during a good mood, it was enough to make up for all the bad. I started noticing a new pattern in abuse when my sister was born. Without logic or reason, if my parents thought I had woken her up or caused her to cry, I was punished. Everything little interaction with her could possibly end in punishment. I didn't want to be in the same room as her at some point. In my 6 to 7-year-old mind, my sister and the abuse were correlated. I convinced myself she was the reason for my suffering. I lived like this for years. We did get along sometimes. We had our moments. However, a vicious cycle would occur. If we bickered, she'd cry. I'd be blamed and beat. I'd vow bitterly to never love her again. The next day, all would be forgotten, and we'd get along. Eventually, something would upset her again. She'd cry. I'd get hit. The cycle would continue. I was dragged through a roller coaster of emotions. I realized early on that the reason why my father wasn't able to just talk anything out was due to his past. He was also a victim of violence. It was easier for him to be angry rather than to peacefully work out problems. My mother was careless and negligent. She wasn't particularly intelligent, and she also had a temper. She was spineless. She saw that my father would fly into a rage, and it seemed to work, so she followed suit. They came from a backwards culture that didn't acknowledge mental health or the consequences of abuse. They were of the mind that if you had food, shelter, and clothes, it was good enough. Feelings were worthless. Despite having relatively well-paid jobs, they were frugal. They were conservatives and survivalists. They lived through the communist revolution. Feelings were frivolous, and mental health was a Western ideology, not a baseline issue to be concerned about. They cared about money, status, saving face, and curating an image of a happy, functioning family. Living as immigrants and as people of color with no green card status was difficult. They took a step down in New York society from the high social status they had back at home. They heard about their friends who stayed behind in China to flourish in the country's economic boom, and part of them wished they had never left. They had worked hard, and they had been accustomed to a certain lifestyle. Now they had to hustle all over again. I'm not justifying their actions, I'm humanizing them. They were embarrassed and disappointed in America. They didn't know where to place their frustrations. When I was 8, we moved again. We were in hiding and evading deportation. The government had denied us residency and citizenship. They stopped working. We had no health insurance, no money coming in. One night after a huge fight with them, I told them I was calling the police. I picked up the phone. Go on. I remember my father saying, do it. Ruin our family. Do you know what's going to happen to you when they discover us? They're going to take you and your sister away. It'll be all your fault. Do you want to be an orphan? He called my bluff. He knew I didn't have the guts, and I never tried it again. A year later, we moved to Canada, right into a ghetto on the northeast side of Toronto. What happened to all the money they had saved for a rainy day? It would be years later that I would piece together the clues. To this day, my parents are unaware that I know. They had been investigated for fraud and money laundering back in New York. That's why they were refused a green card and their bank accounts were frozen. At this point, if my sister did as little as trip and scrape herself, I'd be beat. Eventually, I started inflicting that behavior on others. I'd bully kids in the schoolyard. I'd undress my sister and hit her with the very yardstick my father hit me with. I wanted the rest of the world to feel my pain. I had no remorse. My grades continued dropping. Academic pursuits felt empty. I didn't have friends. I essentially gave up my interests and pride in accomplishments. Everything felt empty at that point. I was absolutely drained. On Christmas Eve, when I was 12, an especially bad beating occurred. It was over my sister once again. I remember thinking something has to change. I can't live like this. I'll die. I didn't speak to anyone at that point. I'd go home from school and withdraw into my bedroom. I was living in fear. I made the decision that night I would never speak to my sister again. I spent ages 12 to 23 having no relationship with her. It wasn't hard. I just outright ignored her. My parents had a problem with it in the beginning, but nothing could stop me. I thought my idea was brilliant. No more interactions with my sister meant not getting hit. She wouldn't be on the receiving end of any more abuse from me, and I wouldn't have to get blamed for her because it would be clear I couldn't have possibly done anything. We didn't even speak. I would leave the room when she entered. I'd eat meals in my bedroom to avoid her. At some point, everyone got used to it. It was bizarre, and we lived like that. My parents eventually found other reasons to lash out at me, but at least it wasn't over her, I justified. It worked until I was about 16. Between that time, I had developed depression. I was an insomniac and suicidal. I self-harmed, had low self-esteem, and continued failing in school. I was an annoying, nasty teenager with no control of my emotions. One day, a kid kicked a soccer ball at my head on my way home from school. I was winded. I said nothing and calmly walked home. I kicked open my sister's door, trashed her room, and beat her up. She hadn't even done anything. I spent my high school years defying my parents. The physical abuse stopped when I was about 14. I started defending myself, and they backed off. Into my senior year, my father pushed me down a flight of stairs in a rage. He said, "I should have beat you harder as a child." It shouldn't have shocked me, but it did. He didn't feel bad at all. It didn't occur to me the way his lack of remorse hurt me. My lack of remorse also hurt others. I stopped speaking to my father as well. That was now two people I was actively ignoring in the house I lived in. A week later, he had a heart attack, and I made the choice to not be by his side in the hospital. He hasn't let that go. A few months later, we were on speaking terms again, but I would never forget that incident. The next time I attacked my sister was a few years later. I flew into a rage and made an attempt to charge into her bedroom. It was over an iPhone. My parents called the police. My sister chose not to press charges, and I was let go. I still had no remorse. I even justified it to my friends. They were complacent and didn't tell me how fucked up I was. I thought it was my right to teach her a lesson. The next few years were a blur of depression, eating disorders, and self-destructive behavior. I experienced my first relationship and my first breakup. I dropped out of university. I became even more withdrawn. I moved out on my own and back in with my parents. I drank. I partied. I was unemployed. I was losing friends. By age 22, I had accomplished nothing, and I had two friends left in my life. One from university and one from childhood. At that point, I felt my relationship with my childhood friend, let's call her M, was slipping through my fingers as well. One day I met a girl, let's call her E, while I was in downtown Toronto. On a whim, I invited her out with me, and we connected. I told E my issues with M. If all you do is call, and she doesn't call you ever, don't contact her and see how long it takes for her to reach out to you. That was the best advice. I waited. After 3 weeks, I realized M was never going to pick up the phone. I made peace with it and moved on. This was a turning point for me. M was my best friend, and it was over. I didn't know I could live without her, but I survived. I latched onto E and spent that summer with her. The relationship didn't work out, but I met a lot of new people on the way. I was trying new things. I was finally opening up. I had never felt so alive. I built my self-confidence and saw that I could be likable and sociable if I just tried. After that summer, I met my boyfriend. I had become a new person, and I made it my goal to move out of my parents' house by the end of autumn. I saw friendships come and go that year, but I was making more friends than I was losing. I was owning up to my mistakes, becoming less judgmental, more understanding, learning about myself. There were road bumps on the way. I found that my boyfriend and I were extremely different people. A lot of our values and ideas clashed. I thought he drank too much, didn't have a lot of ambitions, he was stubborn and had a tendency to be dismissive. He found me to be critical, bossy, argumentative, and quick-tempered. We fought a lot, and I'm not proud to say that at its worst I had gotten very physical with him on numerous occasions. Hurting him made me realize even more that I needed to change. A lot of it had to do with letting go of the past. So about a year later, I reached out to my sister for the first time in a decade. Despite being apprehensive, she agreed to meet up and speak. I owned up to my anger issues. It was obvious the abuse I experienced over the years really affected me, but I took responsibility for the unpleasantness and abuse she received from me. Do you feel like those incidents affected you? I asked. I wanted to access how much damage I did. Not really, she said. I obviously didn't enjoy getting attacked, but I just continued living my life. I didn't really think about it. I was relieved. I assured her I was a different person now. I briefly spoke about the abuse I experienced, what it did to me as a human being, and how it's affected the way I treated relationships. I didn't focus on it for too long because she had a good relationship with our parents, and I didn't expect my words to sway her much. I just wanted her to understand my perspective. I was intent on fixing things. Throughout the next year, we got to know each other. It was bizarre having a relationship with someone I hadn't spoken to in over 10 years, but I was glad she was in my life. We ended up getting comfortable with each other, but the issues regarding my parents were still unspoken between us. During this time, I started working. I was in a long-distance relationship with my boyfriend. I had moved back in with my parents, and I wanted to leave for good. For about a decade, my parents had spent all their time, resources, and energy moving up in the world. They moved into an upper-middle-class neighborhood in Toronto. They had a beautiful home. Their friends admired them, and they were obsessed with the image of perfect suburban domesticity. They spent their time working, purchasing properties, and maintaining them. They had all the money in the world, and they didn't think to enjoy it. None of it was spent. They were overworked and miserable. They could have retired, but they just couldn't let go of the money coming in. They didn't spend much of it on themselves, but when it came to my sister and I, they treated us like money solved everything. If they had a fight with us, they wouldn't apologize. They'd hand you a wad of cash. I didn't even think they did this with much thought. They just did it because that's just what they thought their one responsibility was, to provide financially. I knew this was the case for years, but it was difficult for me to say no. I didn't have any support or guidance from them, and if money was all they could give, I was going to take what I could get. Even my sister admitted that they never showed any interest. They're paying for tuition. You'd think they'd be interested to know exactly what they're paying for. They never ask about university, she said. It didn't surprise me. They had never shown any interest or asked any real questions. They didn't understand why I chose to pursue a design degree. They hated my boyfriend and my lifestyle. I was making my own money at this point and living in their house. It was stupid. I needed to stop taking their money and leave. My boyfriend had moved to London, so I decided that's where I'd be headed. I was anxious. I worked a dead-end job to save for it. After making a series of bad decisions at work, I was fired. I realized I had fucked up and there was nothing left for me here. I was working in Toronto's dull, non-existent fashion industry. I was uninspired. The people in the industry were passionless. I found everyone to be superficial and flashy. They reminded me of my parents and the fake, image-obsessed culture I had been around for so long. So I left to London, and within a few months my sister was planning a visit. I was excited and eager for some company. She didn't feel the same way. She told me I didn't have to spend a ton of time with her, and that we could meet up every other day. She was here for less than a week. I told her I was happy to spend the time. No, I'd prefer to see some of the city alone. I'll let you know when I want to meet up. She was firm about it. I wasn't going to argue. On one of her last nights in London, the topic of our parents came up. Why do you criticize them so much? She asked me. You can't blame everything on them. Not everything, I told her. But what they had done still affects me to this day. I was someone who was more than capable of owning up to my faults. That, however, didn't erase the trauma I had endured. I told her that and she replied, I don't remember the abuse being so bad. That annoyed me. Was she doubting my reality? Was she suggesting I was lying? I said, you know this was happening before you were born, before you were even old enough to have memories. This happened while you were out or in a different room. You weren't there for a lot of it. She replied, I just don't think it was that bad. Also, you fought back. You hit them, I saw it. I had to defend myself at some point, I replied. She fell silent. Well, I know what I saw, she said. And I know what I endured, I replied. You're going to focus on the one time I defended myself, but you're not going to acknowledge all the times I was on the receiving end of the abuse? I was incredulous. I knew she had a good relationship with them, but I didn't think she'd be so ignorant. She didn't have a good reply, so she changed the topic. When are you going to cut them out of your life? You said you would, and you still haven't. You obviously hate them. Why not just do it already? I didn't feel like that was her business. I did tell her numerous times I wanted to cut them out of my life. I read self-help books. Every sign was pointing to it. I resented my parents. But they weren't always monsters. They could be nice. I cringe at how easily I can be swayed by simple kindness. Eventually, they'd show me their true colors again, but it was difficult having these back and forth emotions. I wanted to be in control. I didn't want to admit that despite being treated this way, it was still hard to let go. I didn't have any love left for them. What was left was familiarity and fear. Fear of how I'd make my grandmother feel if I were to finally excommunicate her son. Fear of what my boyfriend's family would think if they knew I dumped my own parents. What does that say about me? I explained these thoughts to my sister. She had no sympathy. Why can't you just do it? It's not that hard. It's complicated, I told her. She had an idea. Why don't you fly back to Toronto? I'll be there and we can all work this out. The thought was naive and idealistic. She acted as if hadn't tried to talk it out with them in the past. I explained to her the number of times I expressed to them I was hurt. I wanted to understand why they did all that to me, whether they had remorse or not. What did they say? She asked. I replied, they said it was me who hurt them, that I was ungrateful, that I exaggerate how badly they treated me. They had dismissed my claims and gaslight me for my entire life. I couldn't possibly get closure. There was no culpability on their part, and there certainly wasn't room for me to forgive. It still didn't register with her. But maybe with me there, they'd be different, she suggested. No, I wasn't going to put myself in an uncomfortable situation like that when I already knew the outcome. Even if presented with an apology that stacked up to expectations, I knew words were only words, and I knew their words would be empty because people don't just change overnight. Change is hard work. I know firsthand. They weren't going to change their ways. The pain would always be there. They would continue making snide comments and putting me down. Without them even saying it, I'd always know that to them I was a disappointment and that I wasn't good enough. I was healing at this point. I liked myself. Talking to them about it again felt like taking 3 steps back. I wanted to move forward. No matter how much I spoke about it, my sister didn't understand. Or maybe didn't want to. My parents were comfortable with our relationship at the moment. I was gone and everything was swept under the rug the way they liked it. I felt better in London and away from the drama. The relationship was beyond broke. It was just a matter of time. I realized what my sister wanted to accomplish was merely out of her own self-interest. She was uncomfortable with the way I was treating the situation. She felt I was being manipulative by still having a relationship with people I openly disliked. I understood it wasn't the most forthcoming thing to do, but emotionally it was difficult, beyond anything she could comprehend. She wanted it to be one big happy family, or have the ties severed altogether. She was very black and white. The gray area made her uncomfortable. I knew I wouldn't be making any stupid decisions just to appease her. I told her to drop the topic. I said to her that I was really taken aback by how utterly cold she was. It seemed like she didn't want to understand me at all. She lacked in compassion. She was secretive and hard to read. That's when she dropped the bomb on me. Do you know why I'm hard to read and unsympathetic to you? I have a lot of my own issues right now. I'm not like you. I can't just talk about my problems. I knew everyone had problems. But what problems did she have? She was immensely privileged, popular, smart. Everything she did seemed elegant and effortless. To me, her life was a walk in the park. Try me, I said. After a bit of convincing, she told me everything. I can't say I was shocked by what she said, but it was crazy to hear it said out loud. She was a prostitute. She'd meet older men, sometimes at clubs for drinks, sometimes for sex. She was fine with it because she did Tinder hookups and it was pretty much the same, except hooking was more frequent and you got paid. A few of her friends had been doing it, and she saw it was easy, fast money. She had been doing it for months up until her visit. She was obsessed with money. She knew exactly how much was in each of her bank accounts at any given moment. She was in university full-time, worked a full-time job for the last 6 months and hooked on the side. She spent the money like it was nothing. Meanwhile, she claimed she was desperate to pay for her dog's vet bills and that our parents refused to help her out. I paid for this London trip with my hooking money, she told me between tears. I really wanted to come see you, and I didn't know how I'd be able to afford it. It certainly didn't sound like she cared that much to see me, since she had implicitly told me that she wanted to spend much of her time in London by herself. If she indeed was so strapped for cash and needed to sell herself in order to afford London, I felt a huge amount of regret for ever inviting her. A few months ago, she told me she had contracted chlamydia after a Tinder hookup and only now admitted that she spent months hooking without having it checked out or taken care of. She also revealed an incident where the John she was meeting with wasn't who he claimed to be. He was older than she expected, and he revealed he was married and had children. Despite not feeling comfortable, she proceeded to have sex with him and went home traumatized. She claimed if she hadn't done it, he would have physically harmed her. I was scared, she said. He raped me. She also had a boyfriend, and the relationship was very on and off. She didn't have the guts to tell him about the STI, the sleeping around, and the prostituting. The guilt of lying to him was killing her. She had only told him about the Tinder hookup, and that already devastated him. She couldn't imagine how he would react if he knew the whole truth. She was also a thief. She owned an astronomical amount of makeup and clothes. I always wondered where it came from, but I never asked. A lot of it was stolen. Around $7,000 of it, she revealed. I didn't even want the stuff that badly, she said. It was there for the taking, and it was so easy. She had been caught stealing at a mall a few years ago. She had told me previously she had been arrested for trespassing on private property. Turns out she lied because she was too embarrassed to admit it was theft. She often stole things to give to her friends and acquaintances in order to ingratiate herself. Nobody knew these gifts were stolen. They just thought she had money. She called herself a good liar who could cover up her tracks. I'm done with this, though, she told me at the end. I feel like I don't even recognize the person who did all this stuff. Something told me she hadn't changed, but I didn't say it. At this point, I realized I wasn't the fucked up one anymore. I was almost relieved. It was satisfying for a few minutes to know the Golden Child Act was a sham. However, I was immediately confused and concerned. Why did she feel the need to do this for money? Our family was well off. They would have given her the money if she had really asked for it. I'm not against prostitution. I think it should be legalized. I'm just not for it if you're going to do it and then cry about it. I felt bad for her. I also felt uncomfortable that she admitted she was a good liar, almost like she was proud. I questioned whether she was lying to my face at this very moment. How many half-truths was she telling me? Maybe there was even more that she was hiding. I let my thoughts settle, and I realized why I wasn't shocked. From what I had observed, everything was already out on the table for me to find the root of it all. She grew up in an affluent neighborhood, and she wanted to keep up with that lifestyle on her own. Our parents watched after their finances meticulously, and while that was a good example to set, my sister took it too far. She loved seeing her bank account grow. We were taught that everything you do in your early life is so that you can go to university, get a job, and make money. While I had been defiant and rejected it, I understood how it was difficult to shake off these ideas that were pounded into us when we were so young. She bought into most of our parents' ideas, so it was no shock to me how desperate and how much pressure she felt to have a certain image and to succeed. She was very fixated on looks. She was very average, but always felt the need to be more. She had bad skin, talked about getting a nose job, and complained about being flat. She wore a lot of makeup and worried about her body. She was naturally fit, but still exercised religiously. She scrolled Instagram frequently, looking at other women with all their bags and clothes on vacations. Her own photos on social media were meticulously thought out, showing tons of skin. All the pictures of her were super exaggerated with large lips and overarched brows. She didn't even look like the same person. She posed with various designer bags and clothing and, of course, made sure to only post her best moments. I knew everyone did this to an extent, but hers was particularly polished. It was no wonder she came across as someone who had an incredibly easy life. Ironically, she had to go to a lot of trouble in order to paint this picture. She told me she was going on 2 more vacations after London. That would make 3 vacations, including London, in the span of less than half a year. I now knew what was paying for all this. It's a well-kept secret that Toronto is one of the most work-hard, play-hard cities in North America. Fidelity and relationships were especially difficult. The women were attractive, there were tons of options, and everyone relied on dating apps. Every other woman I knew in their 20s and 30s were cheating or taking money off a guy in exchange for one thing or another. Everyone was incredibly insecure and cared a lot about their looks. It felt like a Canadian East Coast LA working among the fashion crowd especially. I knew how hard it was to keep up. The culture of excess drove my sister to do things she was ashamed of in order to make some fast money. For months, she'd casually show me scantily clad women posing on social media. I went to school with her, she'd tell me. She met Drake and now he pays for her lifestyle. No clue if this is true. It was obvious these shiny, flashy things appealed to her. She revealed these things in passing, and she thought it was innocuous enough, but it didn't mean I didn't take notice and figure out where a lot of her issues came from. I mentioned this in the least offensive way possible. Maybe you did this because you know so many girls who hook for a living. She adamantly denied it. Actually, if you look at my core group of close friends, they're studious and never go out. I try again. Maybe millennials are a bit excessive, and seeing a certain someone's life on social media can make you question your own life and make you a bit envious of what others have. She deflects my suggestion. I don't like how you talk about it like you're not a millennial either. I tried again. Maybe you grew up super well off in an affluent suburb. You're bored and entitled. That's why you stole things that you didn't even want to begin with. Once again, she disagrees. There are tons of people who live in rich suburbs that don't steal. Really? Was I making such outlandish statements? She wasn't going to listen to any of these reasons. She didn't like to hear anyone else portraying her in any negative light despite admitting to a number of heinous things herself. The truth was hard to hear, and she had no time for it. I left it there that night. I went home and told my boyfriend everything. You need to snap her out of it, he said. What the fuck is she doing? I honestly didn't think it was my place to say anything, so I didn't. Until yesterday. A month goes by, and she sent me a message. She said she had anxiety. She worried her goals were too short-sighted. She asked me if she was worrying too much. You know people have kids at 20, she said. I'm turning 20 and I haven't done anything. I told her not to worry. You're just beginning your adult life. Enjoy it. She continues to say, I need to be financially independent by 28. I want to know that everything I have is mine. I think we'd all like to be independent, I told her. Don't be focused on finances. You have the luxury not to at the moment. You'll make the money when you finish university and get a job. Don't be worried. Worrying has never helped anyone. Actually, I find that when I worry, I get more stuff done. She continues. If I didn't worry about my body, I wouldn't have gone to the gym and have gotten fit. Worrying and caring about yourself are two different things, I explained. One isn't productive, the other is positive and shows you value yourself. You're misunderstanding. To me, they're really the same, she replied. At this point, I almost felt like she wanted to defy every piece of reassurance or advice I gave her just to piss me off. I wasn't sure why she even wanted to talk if she was just going to disagree with everything I said. She then said the most tone-deaf, out-of-touch thing I'd ever heard. I'm 20 and I only have 10,000 in savings. I barfed a little. Was that a humble brag, or was that an actual concern? She liked to talk about how she understood struggle and hardship. She'd mention her friend whose father walked out on the family and left them broke. I heard about her friend from Romania who immigrated to Canada and spent the first 3 months homeless sleeping in a bus shelter. She'd always liked to bring them up as an example of how she identified with poverty and hardship. But telling a story wasn't enough, and I realized she often liked to tell dramatic stories because she liked being the person talking and at the center of attention. It made her seem more interesting and relatable. There's much more to being an empathetic person beyond regurgitating someone else's sob story. Her words didn't mean anything, and judging by how disappointed she was with her finances, it showed she was beyond out of touch with everyday people and reality. She didn't have any humility, nor did she value the right things. She had all the privileges in the world and still wanted more. She only cared for herself. She didn't care that her decisions hurt others or even affected her own health. She would do anything for money, and she hadn't changed a bit. Before she came to visit, I received a call from our father. He told me he had found her passed out on the floor. She was hospitalized for pains and exhaustion. He asked me to call her and tell her to quit her job. It was too much work for her. I did what he asked. I called her, and she reassured me she was fine. She just had cramps. She claimed she wasn't working full-time. It was a lie to get me off her back. I asked our parents about it. They confirmed she was indeed still working full-time. While she was in London, she decided to buy a designer handbag on a whim. She went to purchase it, and her credit card was rejected. I offered to withdraw the money from my card. She agreed, and as we walked back from the ATM machine to purchase it, she asked, I don't have to pay you back, right? I stopped her right there. I'm not working right now. I don't know why you would assume I'd just give you such a large sum of money, I told her. You can transfer the amount back to me when you get home. As we were about to walk into the store, she tells me she didn't want the bag anymore. She assumed I would just pay for it, but when that wasn't the case, she backed out. A few hours later, we were trying on clothes at a store. I counted the money I had originally withdrawn for her and noticed a few pounds had gone missing. I hadn't spent any of it at that point. I asked her to leave the change room to grab me something back out on the sales floor. Then I opened her bag. The exact amount missing from my wallet was stashed at the bottom. It was one of her last days in London, and she had already ran out of cash and had been paying with her card ever since. I took the money back and I said to her, I found it in your bag. Oh, good thing you found it, she said. We didn't speak about that incident again. Thinking back to all that I said to her in present day, you have an unhealthy fixation with money. No more playing around. I wanted to get to the point. Just because I said I wanted to be financially dependent by 28 doesn't mean I have an obsession, she retorted. With the number of things she had implicitly told me, and with the number of things I had observed, she still had the audacity to disagree. With continued patience, I told her I noticed both her and I possessed a lot of our qualities and tendencies similar to our parents. She got angry. Honestly, the reason why I disagree with you all the time is because it triggers me that you blame everything on our parents. You moved. Why don't you just stop talking about them? It pisses me off. She continues. I think I've only now realized how messed up I am because of the way you treated me when we were younger. Red flag. I didn't want to dismiss her in case this was how she truly felt, but I found it real convenient she chose to make this accusation in the midst of an argument. If it bothered her so much, I wish she would have brought it up in a separate conversation. I wouldn't have had a problem with it otherwise. Was I being manipulated? She had been dismissive about my abuse ever since we reconciled. She had rejected all my claims that our parents' treatment of me was a root cause to a lot of my issues growing up and as an adult. According to her, it shouldn't affect me much, and I should take full responsibility. Meanwhile, she felt it was fine to blame me for her feelings and shortcomings. I asked her if I was ever allowed to be a victim. Am I always the villain? Well, clearly you established that you're a victim, she said dryly. She was mocking me. I listed the numerous reasons besides our parents or me for that matter that could have possibly lead to her issues. Everyone knows about nature versus nurture. She didn't want to be told that the way she was brought up and the environment in which she grew up could have possibly affected her negatively. And if that wasn't the case, she didn't want to be told it was possible a few of her not-so-nice qualities were inherent either. You couldn't suggest a single thing without having her get defensive or offended. You don't want to hear anything that you disagree with or doesn't fit into your own narrative of who you are, I told her. She clearly had buried issues, and she was just realizing it. I had done all I could do to repair my relationship with her. I broke the silence over a year ago and offered my friendship. I did it sensitively, and I told her she obviously had a choice. If she wasn't interested or comfortable with having a relationship, she was certainly allowed to say so. I had asked what I assumed to be the right questions. She claimed my treatment hadn't done any damage. Should I have doubted her then? I approached her with the assumption we would both be honest with each other. I apologized nevertheless, and I promised her I would never get physical or angry like that again. I stuck to my word, and I intend to continue doing so, relationship or not. In that year and a half of reconciliation, I had gotten annoyed at times, but never angry. I always made sure to listen and understand. I wasn't trying to fuck up a second time. She made her own choice to open herself up to me and to show that she was able to be forgiving. But she wasn't as forgiving as she thought. She wasn't in touch with her emotions or her past either. I had already done everything I could do. I made amends, and I wasn't about to spend the rest of my life being guilt. I was trying to move on with my life, so I let her go. I honestly need to reevaluate whether I even want to have a relationship with you anymore, she said. Reevaluate, I told her. She was silent for a bit and said, yeah, the answer is no, I don't. I told her I was okay with her decision. After a few hours of silence, she sent me one last text. Just from talking to you, I can clearly tell that you have anger issues that need to be handled, and I should not have to deal with that. That made it real easy for me. That was her final say. It was meant to hurt me. At no point had I spoken to her angrily, cursed, or acted aggressive. Nowhere close. I was concerned for her. I gave her advice, and I tried to say things as carefully and with as little offense as possible. She was using my existing anger issues and mental health as a crutch to manipulate my character and the situation. She wanted to undermine and dismiss how much patience I actually gave her and how careful I was with my emotions around her. She wanted to deliver a final low-blow insult to hurt me. I said it to her, and I wished her good luck. For a long time, I thought she was the one who was normal and went unscathed from the toxicity in which I grew up in. Evidently, she couldn't escape the baggage that came with being part of this family either. It takes a lot to escape this. It takes a lot to be the better person. I had never been interested in being that person. I eventually realized being that way added no amount of value or happiness to my life, so I might as well do my best to be nice. I started talking to a therapist last month before a lot of the drama with her even unfolded. I have a close friend who is successfully managing her sobriety. She helps me through the process of therapy and suggests ways to cope. It hasn't always been easy, but I'm working on it. I am now receiving the help I have always needed, and I hope my sister ends up realizing it would benefit her to do the same.